This week we are talking about subtracting rational numbers, and this is super closely tied to adding rational numbers, but there's one really big piece of information that we need to pay attention to when we're subtracting rational numbers. And so what's new in 7th grade with this is that you have added and subtracted, multiplied and divided fractions and decimals before, but now we start getting into positive and negatives. So if we have this problem, 1 minus 1, that's like starting at 1 and then you take away 1, or you go backwards 1 space. And so what is 1 minus 1? Well, 1 minus 1 is 0. So if 1 minus 1 is 0, then, okay, that helps. Now I'm going to go to 1 plus negative 1, and we're going to see if this is related. Well, if 1 minus 1, this one right here is 1 minus 1. I'm starting, here is 0, here is 1. I'm starting at 1, and then I'm taking away 1. I end up at 0. You can think of like the exact same thing happening when you're adding negative 1. So here's 0 again, here's 1, and now I'm going to add negative 1. So it's starting at 1 still, but now I'm adding negative 1. Well, adding negative 1 is the same as going backwards 1, and so you're going to end up at 0, just like you did at 1 minus 1. So 1 minus 1 and 1 plus negative 1 are the same thing. So that's going to be helpful for us. And another thing that's helpful for us is to think about how subtraction might end up looking like addition. So, for example, if I have 1 plus 1 on our number line again, if I've got 0 and I start at 1, I'm starting at 1, but then I'm going in the positive direction 1. Well, where would I end up with that? I would end up at positive 2. So my answer is positive 2. Now, if I am subtracting a negative 1, I can think of that as this negative means the opposite of this negative. So the opposite of negative is positive, and so it essentially becomes 1 plus 1. Subtracting a negative is the same as adding. So this becomes, I want to leave room for me to write it, that becomes plus 1, 1 plus 1. So 1 minus negative 1 is the same as 1 plus 1, and that equals 2. So when you are, like on this, when you are adding a negative, that's the same as subtracting. Adding a negative is the same as subtracting. Subtracting a negative, this negative undoes that negative, and it ends up being addition. Okay? So, in this problem, negative 4 1/10 minus 7/10. So I'm going to think about, okay, well, negative 4 1/10 minus 7/10. So I could think about it. I've got a number line, and here's 0. Here, about here, I'm not going to do all the marks, is negative 4 1/10, and then I'm going in the minus direction even more, 7 more tenths. Where would that take me? So this right here, you'd be going down 7 more tenths. So you can think of it that way, and you can figure out what this point would have to be. The other way that you could think about it is this is the same as negative 4 1/10 plus negative 7/10. So remember, subtracting is the same thing as adding a negative. So here I turned this into adding a negative. And why this helps me is now I can just say, okay, I've got negative 4 1/10 plus negative 7/10. I can just think of it this as, okay, if I've got 4 1/10 negative plus another, because here's my plus another 7/10 negatives, I've got 1/10 plus 7/10 is 8/10. There's my decimal, 4 whole plus nothing is 4. So I had 4 and 8/10, but all of those were negative because I was adding negatives together. So this is negative 4 and 8/10. Okay? Now, this problem has something that we need to be really, really careful and pay attention to in it. So if I've got negative 1/2 minus negative 5/9. So I want you to remember, when I see minus negative, I should think, oh, that equals plus. I need to remember, okay, minus negative equals plus. So how could I rewrite this without the minus and negative? I want to get rid of that minus and negative. So I'm going to rewrite it as negative 1/2 minus a negative, oh, that is the same as plus. So I'm going to write plus 5/9. Okay, so negative 1/2 plus 5/9. We've got some work to do. Because I remember from last week when we were adding and subtracting fractions, we could not add or subtract them if they had different denominators. And these have different denominators. One denominator is 2 and one denominator is 9. So I need to figure out, how could I make these have the same denominators? Well, 2 does not fit into 9 and 9 does not fit into 2. So I need to find something that they both fit into. And I know that 2 times 9 equals 18. So I'm going to use that fact. I know that 2 times 9 equals 18, and that's going to be my new denominator, is 18. So I've got to figure out how to turn both of those fractions, I wanted that 9, how I can turn both of those fractions into fractions with denominators of 18. All right, let's start with 1/2. So if I have negative 1/2, I want to multiply the numerator and denominator by a fraction so that my denominator equals 18. Okay, so what do I have to multiply 2 by to get my denominator to equal 18? Well, 2 times 9 equals 18. So if I multiply the bottom by 9, I've got to multiply the top by 9. And I get negative 1 times 9 is negative 9/18. Okay, so now I know that this is I'm going to start rewriting this. So this is the same as negative 9/18. Now I have to figure out, okay, I want to turn this fraction into a fraction with a denominator of 18. So I'm going to do that next. And okay, so I want to turn 5/9. I need to multiply it times the numerator times something and the denominator by something so that the denominator equals 18. All right, so what do you multiply 9 by to get 18? What could you put in this box to get 18? 9 times 2 equals 18. If I multiply the bottom by 18, I've got to multiply the top, not bottom by 18. If I multiply the bottom by 2, I've got to multiply the top by 2. So 5 times 2 equals 10. So my new problem is, we got, for negative 1/2, we got negative 9/18. And for adding 5/9, we're now going to be adding 10/18. And that's the exact same problem. It's just that now we made it so they had the same denominator. So here's our new problem, and we've got to solve this now that it's got common denominators. My new problem is negative 9/18 plus 10/18. When I'm looking at problems with positives and negatives, I think to myself, which one wins? Do the positives or do the negatives win? So in order to figure out if the positives or negatives win in this situation, you can just look at it and you can say, okay, negative 9/18 plus 10/18. Well, 10/18, that's more positives than -9/18. So I know that the positives win, but if you want to see how that really works, you can think of it like this. I've got -9, so that's the same as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 negatives. And then I've got 10 positives. That's the same as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 positives. So then you've got to ask yourself, okay, which win? How are there more positives or are there more negatives? So I'm going to cross the zeros out. There's a 0, there's a 0, that creates 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Oh, and look at that. We're left over with 1 positive. 1 positive being left over means that the positives win by 1. So our answer would be +1, except for that we have to remember that it's not just +1, it's +1/18. So I'm going to rewrite this so it looks a bit nicer. And our answer, the positives won by +1/18. So -1/2 minus -5/9 is the same as +1/18. The really important thing to remember is that when you have a problem where you are subtracting a negative, if you are subtracting a negative, that is the same as adding. Also, if you are subtracting, you can think of that as adding a negative. Okay? So minus a negative, subtracting a negative, that's the same as adding. Subtracting is the same thing as adding a negative. Okay, good luck with this, you guys. Remember to pay attention to signs and decimals and denominators, and make sure to reach out if you have any questions.